Welcome back to the channel, my friends. Warhammer Man Studios. I'm Warhammer Man, and today we've got the biggest winners of the new balanced Dataslate. This video is sponsored by CMO Games. More on that later. Alright, so we got the brand new balanced Dataslate from Games Workshop. This is probably going to be the only major update we get for the next 3 to 5 months, because it did come a little bit early, and typically these come out once per quarter. And I want to talk about the 3 biggest winners, and we're going to give some reasons why, how they got better, and what this means for the overall meta. Now, obviously, we'll see how this all flushes out over the next few months. There's been a massive shakeup with the new mission cards, the new rules, and then, of course, the new points as well. But the major overarching theme that we've seen from Games Workshop that's going to make the biggest difference in the meta is the top performers have been all brought down a notch. So everybody that's in the mid-range or at the lower end of the top tier is going to see the biggest improvements if they didn't have any negative stuff, and especially if they had some positive stuff. So because armies like Thousand Sons, Chaos Space Marines, and Necrons all saw some serious nerfs that affects the way they play, as well as armies like orcs, that means that other armies that were already performing well, that got either buffs or didn't get nerfs, should move up and maybe even take away some of those top spots. So Adeptus Sororitas just got their brand new codex, and I definitely think they're going to be nice, but we have to see how the points flush out, because they did go up a lot in points to reflect that all the units are going to be better. So they're actually not on today's list. The first army we're going to be taking a look at is Tyranids. They've been consistently performing well throughout the edition. There's a lot of mid and lower tier armies and builds for Tyranids, and it's not like everybody just picks them up and does extremely well. But the changes we saw to the actual Tyranids rules, on top of a top tier player with that faction and the correct list build and playstyle, have seen a massive benefit this edition. So overall, Tyranids are just going to be good or better now. But if you lean into the new buffs that the army got to Synapse, Shadow in the Warp, and just overall the ability to hunt tough targets like vehicles, I think Tyranids are going to be one of the biggest beneficiaries. So getting started with Tyranids, first off, we saw the Synapse army rule has changed. So while you're within 6 inches of a Synapse creature, each time you take a Battle Shock test, you test on 3d6 instead of 2d6. Now, obviously, Battle Shock is a key component in the game. It only matters when it does, though. So a lot of times people kind of take it for granted, but the fact of the matter is I have oftentimes had a unit, or multiple units even, fail a Battle Shock test, and suddenly that's a 10 or more point swing. So in a game where you're scoring maximum points, which is 90 plus your paint score, a sudden 10-point differential one way or the other can be huge. And it can definitely be the difference between winning a game or losing a game. So the extra D6 that Tyranids have when taking a Battle Shock test gives them a higher statistic probability that they're not going to have a sudden surprise failed Battle Shock and lose a key point. And when I've seen the biggest swings, it's when you're expecting to get points for holding an objective, and then suddenly your unit Battle Shocks, and then not only do you not score those points, but you also miss out on something like Hold More as well. So it's easy to see an 8 or 10 point swing just based on Battle Shock. And especially later in the game where you have less units and you may only have one on an objective, failing that Battle Shock test can be huge. Also, they saw a brand new buff. When you're in Synapse range, each time a model in the unit makes a melee attack, add 1 to the strength characteristic of that attack. So part of the problem with Tyranids is a lot of their stuff is either strength 4 or strength 5. And the issue was they would have trouble getting over key breakpoints. So if you're attacking something that's toughness 3, if you're strength 3, you're wounding on 4s. But if suddenly you get a +1 strength bonus, now you're strength 4, which means you're wounding on 3s. So you're increasing your wound chance by about 15%. And of course that works for all breakpoints, whether it's toughness 4, toughness 10, 12, all the way up. So that extra point of strength oftentimes tips you over the level where you might be wounding on 5s instead it's 4s, or you might be wounding on 4s instead it's 3s. So it might not seem like a massive difference, +1 strength in combat inside Synapse range, but getting over those breakpoints substantially increases your probability of getting a wound on something, and in some cases where you would be wounding on 6s or 5s. So to go from 6s to wound to 5s to wound is a 100% increase in damage output, as now 5s and 6s wound instead of just 6s. And it's the same thing if you were needing 5s or 6s to wound, and then suddenly you hit that breakpoint and now it's 4s. That's a 50% increase in damage output or wounding hits. So massive changes, even though it's such a small little rules change. Next, we have the Shadow in the Warp ability. I have seen this used extremely well. And again, this brings us back to Battle Shock and just how important it really is. It's a one-time army ability where you can basically force your entire opponent's army to take a Battle Shock test. And you can do it at the beginning of the command phase, which means suddenly they go from expecting to score all of their objectives to having to make a Battle Shock just to get that score. And because you can only auto pass one single unit in the entire game, you can force them to spend a command point for a key unit. You make it so it really is a dice roll and not just a guaranteed. And also now, if your opponent's models are within that synapse range or 6 inches, you subtract 1 from that battle shock test. So Space Marines go from a 6 to a 7. A lot of other armies or units go from a 7 to an 8, which means statistically you end up with like a 50% chance of failing that test. And suddenly you could see 1, 2, or even 3 objectives swing. Contested points suddenly go in your favor. This is a massive upgrade to Tyranids. We also saw some changes to things like Crusher Stampede, which has that generic Adeptus Sororitas rule. Add 1 to the hit roll if the model's unit is below starting strength. Add 1 to the wound roll as well if that model's unit is below half strength. So whenever your monsters are attacking, the more damage they get, the more powerful they get, which means that wounding them is actually a benefit to the Tyranids player. In addition, there is some new text here. While the Tyranids monster unit from your army, excluding battle shocked units, is at its starting strength, add 2 to the objective control characteristic of that model's unit. So now all of your monsters in Crusher Stampede have 2 extra OC as long as they're undamaged. So very strong. And then the Untrammeled Ferocity stratagem allows Tyranid players to basically ignore intervening terrain up to 4 inches or less in height. And then there's 2 really powerful caveats as well. It can move within engagement range of enemy models, but cannot end that move within engagement range. So essentially you can move through your opponent's models. You can move through intervening terrain 4 inches or shorter whenever you make a normal move, advance, or fall back. So very powerful stratagem. We see this employed with like knights and many other large units in the game. And suddenly a move block or body block is not nearly as effective. There's also a second bullet point. It can move through sections of terrain features that are 4 inches in height or larger. But if it does, at the end of the move, you roll a d6, and on a 1, you're battle shocked. So now you can basically ignore intervening terrain with this stratagem. And the only downside is that if it's a big piece of terrain, you could potentially be battle shocked. So on super dense boards, this really opens up the potential for Tyranid monsters. And then moving on from there, for the generic data sheets, the Hive Tyrant's Onslaught ability is now an aura of 6 inches, and all ranged weapons equipped by models in the unit have the Assault and now Lethal Hits ability as well. So they have the ability to advance and shoot already. Now that 6-inch aura is giving lethal hits and shooting as well. So extremely powerful, and again, upgrading the ability of Tyranid monsters to destroy tough targets like vehicles. Very powerful. And then in addition to the massive buffs that Tyranid saw, we saw the Neurolictor gain synapse. The Neurotyrant can now be attached to Neurogaunts, Tyrant Guard, and then also Zoanthropes. So a big buff to Zoanthropes having a Neurotyrant inside. A big buff to the actual Neurotyrant himself having a nice bodyguard unit of Zoanthropes. The Broodlord and the Parasite of Mortrex both gain the Shadow and the Warp keyword, which is huge, specifically in smaller games, and also gain the Synapse ability and all the buffs corresponding. And then finally, the last couple things, the Moloch, Raveners, Trigon, all have Vanguard Invader now. So if you're taking that detachment, they all fit much better inside. And then we see the Exocrine range weapon got a +1 strength buff. So now it is 9, which again puts it over some of those key breakpoints. Now it's wounding lighter vehicles on 4s instead of 5s, which is big. And then the Tyrannofex damage profile is now a D6 +6. So it still has the random element with the D6 damage, but it has a flat 6 to go with it. So very, very powerful. Definitely some nice buffs for Tyranids, and I do expect to see them at the top of the meta.
Now a quick message from today's sponsor. CMO Games has been selling Games Workshop products online for over 20 years. They carry the full line of Games Workshop products, including Warhammer 40,000, Age of Sigmar, Necromunda, Blood Bowl, paint tools, and more. Almost all Games Workshop products are priced at 15% off MSRP. CMO Games takes pre-orders for most Games Workshop products released at their earliest date possible. 12:01 a.m. on Saturday, they go live. Most of these pre-order products are also priced at 15% off MSRP. CMO Games offer free shipping in the US 48 with an order of $50 or more. Their customer service is top-notch, and they ship most orders within 24 hours. Visit CMOGames.com using the affiliate link in the description and let them know that you heard about CMO Games from Warhammer Man. Now, back to the video.
All right, next we have Dark Angels. So the main issue with Dark Angels was actually mortal wounds, and we're going to talk a little bit about Custodes as well. The problem is that they have a lot of built-in abilities that protect them from mortal wounds, but the changes Games Workshop made early in the edition, separating out mortal wounds and devastating wounds, made it so that the protection didn't work anymore. So suddenly they lost a lot of their inherent durability, and now the Games Workshop has basically rolled those changes back and changed the wording on them. The Dark Angels and the Adeptus Custodes both have that full mortal wound protection back, and obviously mortal wounds and devastating wounds are extremely powerful in this edition. So many of the units having a 4-up shrug, whether it's once a game or just built in all the time, makes those units substantially more durable. Specifically with the Custodes, who have a 2-up, 4-up save on most of their models, and now a 4-up shrug as well for mortal wounds, means that I think we're going to see them surge in durability, popularity, and overall success rate. Same with the Dark Angels. A lot of the Dark Angel specific units have a once per game ability to proc a 4-up shrug against mortal wounds, and now that it affects devastating wounds, things like Terminators, things like Lionel Johnson are going to be extremely powerful and substantially more durable. We also saw some changes to like the actual detachments for Dark Angels, so they're a little more incentivized to go with the Dark Angels detachments and not just the generic Space Marine detachments. First is Grim Resolve detachment rule for the Unforgiven task force. Pick one unit in your army and add one to the OC until the next command phase. So very good. Obviously it's all about scoring points, and this definitely helps them. Then we see the Inner Circle task force detachment, and the Vowed Target detachment rule has some buffs as well. So now in addition to having your picked Vowed Target, you also have Defensive Footing and Aggressive Push. Defensive Footing, you're picking one objective you control, and until the start of your next movement phase, that is your vowed objective. So that gives you a little more dynamic ability inside the game. Once you take control of an objective, you want to hold that objective, you can turn that into your vowed objective and gain all of the benefits from strats and then also your army rule. And next we have Aggressive Push. You can select one or more objective markers you do not control. Until the start of your next movement phase, each of those objective markers is one of your vowed objective markers. If a rule refers to a unit or model being within range of your vowed objective marker, the rule takes effect if that unit or model is within range of one or more of your vowed objective markers. So now suddenly you're picking any objectives that you don't control, and all of them become your vowed objective markers. So again, very, very powerful, as there's a bunch of strats that affect this, and then also the generic rule is that you add one to the wound roll. So Dark Angels are going to be substantially more punchy, in particular their infantry, on those vowed objectives. And then also we saw some necessary changes to the Deathwing Knights melee weapons and a couple other of the Dark Angel specific melee weapons. The Mace of Absolution is now Anti-Monster 4-up, Anti-Vehicle 4-up, and it has AP -2. It was originally AP -1 and just wasn't that good. Now at AP -2, it's right in line with other Terminator weapons. We also saw the power weapons on the Deathwing Knights go from damage 1 up to damage 2 where they ought to be. So again, now they are substantially more effective. In many cases, their damage output is twice as good. And then the final changes are the Inner Circle Companions melee weapons. And again, these have been brought in line with things like Blade Guard. First, we saw the changes to points, which made them the same points cost as Blade Guard. But obviously, they don't have the invulnerable save, but they have a bunch of other cool buffs as well. Now, the Strike ability is AP -2 instead of AP -1. And the Sweep ability has 5 attacks, which is 1 less, but it has AP -2 instead of AP -1. So now the damage output for Inner Circle Companions is much more in line with things like Blade Guard and does much better into armies like other Space Marines with 2 or 3-up saves, and then the potential to proc Armor of Contempt. So now, even if they use the Armor of Contempt ability, they're still not just taking flat armor saves. So very powerful, definitely some massive updates. Also, Lionel Johnson got some points decreases down to 300 in the last points drop. And now with his bubble aura giving protection from mortal wounds and then also dev wounds with the rules changes, he is going to be an absolute linchpin in Dark Angel's armies, and I do expect to see him taking the table much more often, even in competitive play. All right, and then last but not least, we see the Adeptus Custodes. First off, the most important rule is what we just talked about with the Dark Angels. The protection now from mortal wounds and then also devastating wounds means that there's no easy way around their awesome armor saves. So suddenly those 2-up armor saves with 4-up invulnerable saves, protection against devastating wounds and mortal wounds means they're going to be substantially more reliable. And this was the main change that they needed to get back their ability to remain durable and stay on the table even with their low model count. We also saw some minor changes to the Shield Host detachment, Martial Mastery detachment rule. At the start of the battle round, you can select one of the bulletin points below. If you do until the start of the next battle round, the bulletin's points effect apply. So that means not only do the martial abilities help in combat, now they are buffs on the unit for the entire game turn. So very powerful, definitely upgrading the damage output of the Custodes. And then also the Orc Champions detachment, Assemblage of Might detachment rule. Previously, these just affected the characters in your army and you were supposed to build around like these heroes. Now they have changed the wording, so each time a model in an Adeptus Custodes character unit from your army makes an attack that targets an enemy unit, add 1 to the wound roll. So instead of the characters being +1 to wound, which is a nice buff, now the entire unit that has an attached character is +1 to wound. So again, substantially increasing the damage output and their ability to take out high strength or durability targets. So obviously there's tons of other changes. Lots of other factions benefited from this, such as the Adeptus Mechanicus. But as far as Tyranids, Dark Angels, and Adeptus Custodes, I fully expect them to be really bumped up in the meta. They were all already good, but now they're going to be substantially better. And then with the best factions being brought down, I definitely think we're going to see these three factions in contention for some of those top spots. There was also lots of points changes as well, and a lot of those things will be affecting the meta and what shakes out. And we'll see over time who's really on top. Am I right? Am I wrong? But that's at least my initial take on this. So let me know what you think down below. Always like to hear back from you guys in the comments. That is our top 3 factions that benefit from the balanced Dataslate in no particular order. But overall, I think the biggest change is mortal wounds and dev wounds getting rolled back together into one thing. And then also the Tyranids really being able to get over those breakpoints and affect Battle Shock. So as always, special thanks to CMO Games for sponsoring the channel. Check out the link in the description to save 15% on Games Workshop products. That's it for today. Warhammer Man Studios, I'm Warhammer Man. And we'll see who benefits the most from these changes. But I definitely think these 3 factions are in contention for the top spots. And I'm out of here.